So, what is the impression about this country, Japan?
I've only been to Tokyo so far, but I love it. I was telling some friends, it reminds me of, it's basically a Japanese New York City. You know, it's a big metropolis.
This place looks like a Times Square.
Totally, yeah.
Yes.
But what I do like about it that's different than New York is that it's not, New York is very grid-like, you know, square,
yes.
and Tokyo's really kind of organic and little streets, and it's easy to lose yourself and get lost in all these little roads and pathways. It's very cool.
Yeah. Okay. So, what was your first experience with heavy metal?
I guess my older brother, you know, was into like hard rock, Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and classic rock stuff. And I think it was just one of those things where I remember buying records based on the album cover, and I saw like, you know, Destruction and Possessed, but I was also in the tape trading scene. So back then we used to just trade tapes, and you find out about new bands, but it was pretty much from classic rock, hard rock from my older brother to me going more extreme. I mean, literally Metallica demo, you know, and Megadeth, and later on, and
Left to Leather,
Slayer, so it was all that stuff.
And what was a trigger to be attracted to the complicated stuff? Is it after you got
I think so. I think it was spending more time on my instrument and realizing I had a real genuine passion to play guitar. And I started to study, and when I get into high school and started studying jazz, I realized that how vast, you know, the language of music is, and that I wanted to, you know, be better and have some skills. So I worked harder, and I think that lent itself, once we started listening, you know, to more progressive music like fusion and jazz, the ears just opened more, and then the music got more complicated, you know, as a result. So it's always been more about trying to, you know, do music that feels natural, and I think if you're at a certain level of a player, you just are going to gravitate towards maybe more complex music. But at the same time, you're always trying to make it simple. So it's one of those things where I prefer it to not be obviously complex. I'd rather it be deceptively complex, you know. So it just sounds like good music. That's really the idea.
Okay. So who do you think was the first band to incorporate technicality, complexity, and extreme metal? Maybe Watchtower or?
Yeah, Watchtower, I mean, they weren't extreme. I mean, the vocals were melodic, so they didn't really go to the extreme metal place, but they certainly pushed the envelope in terms of being extremely complex and fusion influenced. There was a bunch of bands, for even going further back, if you look at Mahavishnu Orchestra, Gong, I mean, all these fusion groups. I mean, there was definitely elements of very complex music going on, to varying degrees of heaviness, you know, depending on the time, the decade. But it seems like it's always been going on. It's just depends on what era you look at, you know, in terms of the types of bands that were leading in a little way. I mean, I remember hearing, you know, Metallica do Battery, you know, Master of Puppets, and it was like, wow, this is kind of proggy, you know.
Yes, it was.
And so there was, even back then, and Slayer on Show No Mercy, Cryonics, you know, it was kind of their take on Maiden, you know, a little more. Yeah. So it's always, there's little variations of it that's been going on all the time, and I think we all just kind of do our own version of it as each generation.
Then how was the scene in Florida in the early days? There seemed to be a lot of innovative.
Yeah, Florida was a hotbed. You know, we had so many cool bands: Obituary, Morbid Angel, Death. You know, Nocturnus. It was like there were so many bands, and it was a deicide. You know, and I remember really it was funny because there was Florida and then there was Sweden.
Oh
and
yes,
Sweden,
two death metal mecca. You know,
right. And what was interesting with Florida was that all these bands were coming out at the same time, Atheist, you know, CYNIC, but none of us sounded like each other.
Yeah,
you know, we all sounded very different, yet we were all in the same scene, so it was really cool.
Yeah, there are so many technical bands like you guys, Death, Atheist, maybe Hellwitch, and you know.
Yeah, Hellwitch were awesome. I remember Pat Raniere, he was a friend,
Okay, So what was the experience in death like?
Well, I mean, Chuck, I knew Chuck through the tape trading scene, and he just really started out as a friend. So he was really more of like an older brother to me in a way. You know, he was 5 years older, and we developed a friendship, and then we became guitar buddies. And he always had death, and then I think what happened was, over time, he's trusted me more through the friendship, and he had a situation on the Leprosy tour where he parted with Rick Ross in the middle of a tour, and he called me, and I remember saying, "I need help. Can you come?" And that was the beginning of our professional relationship. You know, going beyond a friendship. Before that, it was just getting stoned and hanging out. You know, but so we ended up. You know, after that, I think I played on that tour, a bunch of dates, or I did Mexico actually with him. And then we went to, and then he went back and he made Spiritual Healing, and I toured with him when he partied with James Murphy. I toured for that record a little bit, and then it was, Human came next, and I think he just knew us and was comfortable with me. I introduced him to Sean, and it was a matter of just trust, at that point to make an album together. So it was an evolving relationship from a long time ago.
So maybe you were one of the reasons that death took more complicated path?
I think we were definitely, Sean and I were kind of the nerdy prog jazz guys, and Chuck wanted to grow, he wanted to push the envelope with death sound, and I think that he realized, in terms of the death metal scene, he felt like there wasn't much further to go in terms of extremity. So it's like, what can we do? Well, let's get more musical and more technical. And so he started to really appreciate, I remember, Watchtower and bands like that, and he really wanted to kind of bring that into the sound. So I think, it was definitely a part of our sensibilities interacting with Chuck's, and it really, it worked.
Okay. I think jazz is one of the biggest inspiration of CYNIC's music. So who are your favorite jazz players, artists?
Probably my biggest influence, really, of all time, is Pat Metheny. I mean, he's just but I grew up, listening to all kinds of jazz and fusion, from Metheny and Holdsworth was another big one, to a lot of those fusion bands like Mahavishnu Orchestra and Chick Corea, Return to Forever, and God, there were so many great bands from that era. But I think it was like we were inspired by a lot of the jazz in terms of the how complex the chromaticism, but also loved the extreme music. So they kind of melded into this weird sound, that we didn't even know where it was coming from, other than that it was just, this is what we were listening to.
Okay. And you named Claude Debussy from France, the classical
composer. Oh, of course,
Debussy.
Yeah, and Bach. I mean, I was always influenced by Bach as a composer. Just his such beautiful harmonic and melodic movement. And Debussy, he's like a jazz, classical guy. So sophisticated.
Is classical music a big inspiration too?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Ravel and Debussy. And
French stuff.
Yeah, Stravinsky.
Russian.
But it's interesting how, because people talk about the different classical and then jazz, and one thing I learned a long time ago, when I was studying both, really was I had a teacher. We would do the Bach inventions, those two-part inventions, and he would have me swing them, just like swing the rhythm, and suddenly it sounded like bebop, and it was a total, normally played, to a straight, very Baroque kind of approach, but then when you swing it, it suddenly became jazz, and it was interesting to see how jazz actually had those roots. It was kind of the blues and the classical sensibility kind of merged into this street sound.
So did you learn music theories?
Yeah, I studied theory. I mean, I feel I'm not at the, like Sean Malone, our bass player, is like a professor of theory, and he teaches it. But I feel like, we all took, went to college and studied theory and did a lot of homework, but I feel like I still am a beginner. you never get a hold of this.
Jazz theories.
Sure, yeah.
Well, do you think the old metal musician should learn it, as an advice to the younger musician? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really just good to just use your, follow your heart, really just do what feels right and inspires you. And if you're interested in delving deeper into musical language, jazz and even classical is very helpful in that sense, because it'll expand your ears and give you a greater sense of the language,
So what is your composition process like? It's very hard to imagine how the songs by CYNIC were composed. Some start with a chord progression, others start with melodies, but what about yours?
Yeah, for me, I write a lot on just guitar, and I accumulate a lot of material, and then over time I listen back to that material, and the material that I really like, I end up kind of gravitating towards that and developing it. And then sometimes that material has a melody already inherently in it with the guitar part, or it's just an instrumental piece of music. But it's really just a process of coming back to something and trial and error until you really like it and you're developing it. So everything just takes time. I always think writing is something that requires the utmost patience, to really spend time with an arrangement and to flesh it out properly. It's very rare that a whole song happens quickly, especially with CYNIC.
How do you keep the balance between complexity and consistency? Do you think if there's a fine line between a complicated but can be taken as an actual song and it just jumbles or riffs? I think it's very difficult to...
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like I'm always motivated by just having a great song. So regardless of complexity or how you get there, you want to walk away feeling something and maybe singing something, So it's really driven by song, and I think that's maybe been CYNIC's, pun intended, focus really has always been, let's make this as complex as it may seem. It's always come back to the song. What is the root idea here? So a lot of CYNIC's motifs and use in our music is very deceptive, because when you take one of our songs, it might only be 3 or 4 ideas, but we turn them inside out. So it repeats later on, but you don't know it's that same part that you just heard 3 sections ago, but now we're playing it in a different time signature.
It's like a variation technique.
Variations on a theme. Yeah, that's a big way that we approach song, is just kind of exploring. I'll take one idea and then I'll just try everything possible with it to kind of build it or develop it. So a lot of the material is actually quite simple, but it's the way that it's produced, and arranged that it ends up becoming kind of a CYNIC thing. But I can play all of it on acoustic guitar. It can sound like folk music.
So the listeners feel something consistent,
exactly,
even if they're not aware of.
Yeah, I think a lot of if your focus is being technical or being a lot of the gent music is so rhythm based. There's not a lot of strong melody there. I feel like if your focus is on just having a strong song, and you kind of make that the whole thing that it begins and ends with, everything else just becomes an addition to it. It doesn't really matter. It's really should be driven, at least for us, by what you're feeling, what you're left with. I think a lot, if you over tech, which is a lot of, I think you get eager when you develop some skill, you over tech it up, and it loses its soul. It gets very mind.
Complexity for complexity.
Yeah, instead of heart, which is what we're trying to do, is go more heart prog.